Hello, everybody. Welcome to Latter-day Struggles. This is your host, Valerie. I am so excited to once again have my dear friend and colleague, Jeff Strong, here with me today. Hi, Jeff.
Hi, Valerie. So good to see you.
Yes, likewise. We have been having so much fun as usual. I always enjoy talking to you, no matter what the occasion is, but it's really fun to be with you today, once again, talking about this book. We have talked about the research and the forthcoming book for a couple of years now. So, in some ways, this
Yeah.
is pretty exciting because I know how long and arduous and heartfelt and prayerful this whole entire task has been for you. And it is pretty special that we are at this moment where the book has been published and it is being received well. Before we jump in, and I'm going to do a little overview and we'll have we'll jump into some new content today, but I think it would be fun right now to just talk about how is the book being received because this has only been out for what, just a few weeks now, right?
Well, time flies. So it went on sale on Amazon April 17th, so almost 2 months ago. And there was a 30-day pre-sale window where we were taking orders but not shipping. So it's been shipping for about 3 weeks, on sale for almost 2 months. It's doing extraordinarily well. We talked about this before, Valerie, but I think when you have a community where there's an issue that's really important and it's affecting people, but we're not really talking about it for a variety of reasons, and then somebody says, "Hey, let's talk about it." There's almost this pent up need to talk and engage and work through issues. And I think that's what's really driving the interest in the book is this is an issue that's affecting so many Latter-day Saints and so many families, and people are ready to talk about it now, I think. So it's number one at Amazon for Latter-day Saint books, Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, Faith Deconstruction, and Christian Social Sciences. Um, 83% of the reviews so far on Amazon are 5-star ratings. And so it's getting a lot of attention. People are buying the book, they're reading the book, it's resonating with them. And of course, there are critics too. I wouldn't be honest if I didn't say they're not critics. But I think whenever you're talking about sensitive and complex things, you're going to have people that have different points of view, and that's fine.
Yeah, I agree. And what comes up for me is that, when we think about addressing a need and addressing a pain point, I would say that there is so much need, and all parties involved in this situation, right? The deconstruction or the Mormon faith crisis. Everyone is having a lot of big feelings, and I think what I really appreciate about the work that you do that complements the work that I do is that what we want individuals and families to thrive.
Yes,
And
absolutely.
and unless we can't thrive if we can't talk about what hurts. And if we don't dignify that all parties have legitimate experiences and that they're feeling a lot of very big things, and if we can't wrap words around it and talk about it and create bridges of understanding that legitimize both or all experiences, then we'll never find resolution and we'll never find a place where we can better understand each other. Because to me, it's more about understanding one another than necessarily needing to uh, end the day seeing the same thing. It's more
Yes.
about, yeah. So, anyways, I really, really appreciate that these kinds of conversations hopefully will open new doors and windows of understanding so that we can connect and see one another more clearly. Because I think it's the lack of ability to truly see what the other is seeing or have a perspective, put ourselves in the shoes of our devout loved ones if we're on a faith journey, or put ourselves in the shoes of someone on a faith journey if we're on the more devout side. And that to me is what I love about what you and I are both doing because we love all of the parties involved in this.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yes.
You know what's fascinating? I love your comment so much, Valerie, because what you're saying is regardless of which side of the issue you might find yourself on or where you end up, relationships matter, families matter, marriages matter, communities matter. I mean, our kids are on the same soccer teams,
Yeah.
sitting at the same dinner tables. If I could, I'd like to share an interesting perspective from the last 2 weeks, where most of the people I talk to are people who are trying to understand why someone they love stepped away from the church, right? And so that's probably the most common person that would reach out to me to say, "Hey, somebody I love stepped away, and I'm trying to understand why." But in the last couple of weeks, I've had two that have gone the other way. So in one case, it was this lovely family. I won't say too much, but a lovely family in another part of the country, and they are not believers, right? So they're not Latter-day Saints, and they aren't believers in general. And they have a child that is marrying a Latter-day Saint, and it's causing them incredible angst, just terrible angst, because they have non-religious views. They have a certain take on the church, and they're just terrified that their daughter is going to be joining our church, and they're full of fear about what that might mean for their relationship with her and her life, and what might happen down the road with grandchildren. And so it was an extraordinary conversation I had with them to talk about these issues from that vantage point, right? And there was another one where somebody that I'm pretty close to, who left the church, 40 years ago, has a child who uh, has joined the church and has a Latter-day Saint boyfriend, and she decided to go on a mission. And so this parent is really having a difficult time with, wait a minute, I left that church, and you've joined it, and not only that, you want to go on a mission. And so it's fascinating to me. People end up in different places, even among family members, and generation to generation, things change. And so if we can develop the ability to navigate these changes, there will be a lot less stress and damage in the community, I think.
I really love how this one book is actually creating bridges and also creating a platform to have people talking about what they're fearful of, what they're worried about, what some of maybe I don't know, like prejudices,
Sure.
misunderstandings, or
Yes.
or even or even they may have their own experiences, like somebody who left the church, but maybe never like went through sort of a healing process so that they could make sense of the church's impact on their life on both sides of the spectrum. And so I think the more we can remove the taboo from talking about
Amen.
Mormonism in all of its variations, meaning that
Yes.
there's I think everything in this world is, you could argue is there's neutrality, and then we bring the best and we bring the worst into what we infuse
Yeah.
into our systems and our religious systems, and so this is a context that is in some ways. Sometimes we don't talk enough about it. We have a lot of emotional experiences that we don't really process. And so, what I want to do is help us become more critically thinking, more capable of talking about truth as it is, not as we wish it was, right? Less about the faithful narrative and more about the real narrative, so that as people are acquainted with the church in any sort of a context, they can kind of have a little bit more of a pragmatic approach to it and work with it in its like from the perspective of reality, not
Yeah.
either making it like I know Chris Kimball had talked about this in his book a couple of years ago. It's neither the evil kingdom nor the magic kingdom.
Right.
It's a messy human experience
Yes.
of human beings trying to wrestle with spirituality. And if we could sort of see it that way, demystify it, then I think we would all do better. And I think this is what your book is actually trying to do.
Yeah, it's a part of the human condition. If we can just normalize it,
Yeah.
you know, instead of seeing it as this giant outlier, this terrible thing,
Yeah.
everybody will exhale, blood pressure will come down, better conversations can take place. And so it's a world we should all be striving to get to.
Yeah. Very good. Let's go ahead and I want to open our new conversation today by giving a bit of an overview of what you and I have sort of covered in the last couple of episodes. So, Jeff, in preparation for the writing of this book, actually, well, he was doing research on disaffiliation and on patterns connected to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints before this book was even a twinkle in his eye. And then it became a book, or the idea of the book sort of emerged from some research that he was already doing. And so we spent a little bit of time talking about the rate of disaffiliation in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And that is in the service of just kind of sort of speaking into the fact that this is happening. And it's actually happening at a pace that is increasing as the years go by. And Jeff and I also talked about how his book goes deeply into the experience of those who disaffiliate from the church, and also how there are many people who, while having very complex issues with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, also at the same time feel deeply identified with it because it is a part of their DNA.
Yeah.
And how many people, while changing and differentiating themselves in many ways, as when it comes to belief and practice, many of us really feel or wish we could continue to belong. And that is a big tension that this book is hoping to address. We also talked about how loved ones who are more traditionally believing feel about this, how there comes often there's an impasse, or there's this desire to connect, but there's also so much grief and big feelings that it's hard to talk about this. We also spent some time talking about the resiliencies that our Latter-day Saint community has already uh, experienced in its almost 200 years history, meaning that what Jeff's doing in this book is trying to normalize that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has had to pivot and has had to address very hard things before. I think you're doing that, Jeff, in the service of sort of heartening members to have the courage to say, you know what? We can do this. We can look reality in the eye. We can address that we are getting signals from our friends and our loved ones who are leaving that things are not well, and we can pivot so that we can become a culture that embraces what's actually happening in our homes, our families, and in our culture, so that our church community can become one of increased acceptance of the growth journey as it is unfolding in and around so many of our lives. And so I think that takes us pretty close to where we left off last time. And I do want to say, Jeff, and then I'm going to pass this over to you. You mentioned in the very end of our second episode that what we had on the docket to talk about today is the most important of the content. Now, I would love to hear you sort of take that and move us into our today's conversation.
That sounds great. And your summary was so well done. So thank you for that. Yeah, the stuff we're going to talk about today is part three in the book, and it's really the heart and soul of the book. And so, part one, we talk about how many are leaving and why they leave and what that process looks like. Part two, I get into sort of the broad landscape that disaffiliation is taking place on, all the factors around us that are contributing. But part three, I get right into Latter-day Saint culture. And as we talked last time, Valerie, culture, there are some people that have said, well, Jeff, I don't understand why you're so focused on culture. In focusing on culture, are you minimizing other factors like church history or the disagreements people may feel with the church on social issues? And the answer is no, I'm not minimizing those things. Those, the four waves that we talked about in a previous episode are the reasons people cite for leaving. But I think culture determines whether those reasons are amplified and made more acute, or whether they're relieved to a degree and made more manageable. And so part three really gets into the way that culture does that in our church. And it's not because I think culture is more important than those other reasons, but culture is something that's within our control, right? It's something going forward, it's something we can actually work on. For example, our history is what it is. We can't change it. That's just historical fact, right? But culture determines, well, how open are we about how we talk about it? Can we talk about it in an open and transparent way without becoming, defensive or adversarial? That's culture. And so if we can learn how to do that culturally, then we have a chance to make those historical tensions more manageable, as an example. Make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. And I mean, I'm really grateful that you actually brought that tension up because I guarantee that my listeners
Yeah,
are pushing back on that. They're saying,
sure.
"Wait a minute, you are minimizing some of the very real issues and saying it just has to do with culture." And if I'm not mistaken, Jeff, I think that was I was one of those pusher
Yeah,
backers,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
and I stand by that. But I also understand what you're saying in that there are struggles that are very, very real that are upstream. Especially, I mean, you brought history up, so we'll stay with that as our
yeah,
example.
yeah,
It would be so much better if we could address our history more directly from the
yeah.
top down, no question about it. And I think there is argument, and I agree that the church is trying to do that. There has been sort of a trickling, slow, if subtle, and not very well publicized release of more and more and more, and I'm grateful for that. Right? So, the gospel topic essays and things like that. So things are sort of um, slowly improving in that realm, right? And yet also
Yeah.
at the same time, there are those of us in my generation that say, for example, we learned some things well beyond the time when they should have been like normalized and talked about. And just sort of addressed as our messy human history, as opposed to it being sort of the oh gosh, there's a way we talk about it, like a faith promoting narrative as opposed to a true narrative, right? And so we get that, and I'm glad that we're saying those things out loud because those are
Yeah.
problematic, and those are reasons why people have a legitimate faith and trust crisis. And what I think you have made the choice to do is to say yes, and meaning that yes, that exists, and it's so much worse when a legitimate faith and trust crisis becomes a relationship, isolation, and judgment crisis by our loved ones, family, friends, and ward members. That's what we're talking about here in terms of can we take what is complex and become a culture that nurtures our loved ones as they are addressing these very relevant issues in their own faith journey. That's, I think, where you really wanted to hone in on in part 3 of your book. What are things that you found or that your research found as far as, I believe you were calling it, let me just see here, the imbalances. What
Yeah.
is imbalanced and how could we as a culture or create a culture that's more balanced so that people that are experiencing these things can feel nurtured and nourished as opposed to feel as if they are wilting in this culture and need to go elsewhere to continue to grow. So how about I give this back to you and you start us
Yeah,
off
that
on.
sounds great. Well said, Valerie. And so I think in sum, the thing I would want to leave your audience with is I see all of those reasons very clearly that people cite for leaving, church history being the biggest and social issues being the second biggest. And those are the reasons. Um, my ability, your ability to change those reasons is quite limited, but our ability to change how we deal with those reasons is not limited, right? That's culture. And so, I mentioned in our last episode that it was my son, Kale, who left the church that suggested that I really study the etymology of the word culture. And I learned that it means dirt or soil for the purpose of growing things. And I think it's just an extraordinary metaphor for studying and talking about this problem. And so, as we talked about last time, briefly, just to refresh everybody's memory, soil serves two purposes, right? Purpose one is it has to provide stability and protection for the plant, right? It has to hold the roots in place. And that's sort of the institutional side of church culture, right? It's authority, it's doctrine, it's leadership, it's boundaries, it's standards. But the other part of the soil is it has to nourish the soul. It has to help people learn, grow, connect, thrive, and live abundant lives. And so my personal belief is that in order for the church community to be helpful, these two aspects of the cultural soil have to be in proper balance. And then what's clear from our research, and we can get into a little bit of the data on this if you like, is that right now most members believe that the balance spectrum is tilted pretty hard towards this protection and stability side and not to the nourishment side. And so they feel they would say, "Oh yeah, I feel it's plenty protective and stable, but I feel like I'm going spiritually hungry,
Yeah.
right? I need the living water and bread of life, and I'm having a hard time extracting it from this cultural soil." Make
Yeah.
sense?
Yeah, that does make sense. And I think that's where your imbalances come in, right? Is that kind of where we wanted to
Yeah,
go
yeah.
today?
Let's
Yeah.
let's let's dive right in. And I use a and pardon me, I don't think your audience will mind, but there are some audiences that do mind that I've done this. But I've taken the parable of the sower and I've sort of repurposed it for modern times. And I've said, okay, well, in the parable of the soil, in the original parable, the sower sows seeds, which are essentially the gospel, into different types of soil, and the soil represent people's hearts, right? And so for example, there's hard and unyielding soil. In other words, people don't make room for the gospel in their heart, and so they reject it, and then there's no growth. I changed the parable a little bit. I'm not trying to be sacrilegious or heretical, but I said, well, what if we change the parable a little bit to speak more to current times where the seeds are people, right? And God has scattered people across the earth, across communities in all their varieties. And the soil is the way that people are received in different church communities, right? And so imbalance number one is soil that is hard and unyielding, right? And so the imbalance is too narrowly defining who's acceptable in the church. And the tension is when you or people you love are marginalized, that creates incredible tension, right? And so it invites the big question, which is, well, who is the church for, right? Is it only for a particular type of Latter-day Saint, or are those the only people that are going to be embraced and allowed to take root in the soil of the church? Or is it for a broader cross section of people? And so imbalance number one really explores that.
What I loved about your starting with this topic is the fundamental question about what even is a church for in
Yeah,
general,
yeah,
right? And
yes,
I think this is a big question and conceivably controversial because I think that for some people, a church is to gather and make sure that everyone believes the same way.
yes.
And I think that's to sort of stay with your metaphor. If we're on the side of protection that leans sometimes towards rigidity, then really church becomes a place where conformity is privileged over reality. And if that is the case, then people that are feeling as if they are unwelcome or unaccepted because they are having deeply spiritual experiences that are diverse,
Mhm.
then they're going to go away. And so, to that end, I guess this is kind of my final thought on this is if that is what the LDS Church wants to be, then they're probably doing a good job because they're kind of
Yes,
saying, this is who gets to be here. This is the
yeah,
size of the church that we want, this demographic, and the rest of you do need to go find other soil. If that's what they're communicating, then, or if that's what they're wanting to communicate, then that's what is happening.
yeah.
So it's a good question.
Yeah, and Valerie, I'm going to just share some interesting insights and a little bit of data to give listeners just a sense for the issue. By the way, I think most people get the issue, right? Because they're particularly your audience, because you're living on the edge of this tension, right? And if you're a very traditional, devout, Orthodox Latter-day Saint, you're kind of going, what tension? This is perfect. The culture of the church is perfect, perfect for me at least. And so one of the interesting things we asked people in our survey who should feel most at home in the culture of the church. And we gave them three answers to pick from. The first answer was everyone. The second answer was those who are all in. And the third answer is anyone sincerely seeking God. Okay, so three very different perspectives. And the first time we asked the question, we said, okay, tell us what you think is the common belief or expectation in the culture? And here were the answers. Again, who should feel most at home in the culture of the church? According to the culture, everyone, only 2%. Those who were all in, 83%, and anyone sincerely seeking God, 15%. So, what that says is people are saying, okay, we think the culture of the church is clearly making a statement that those who are most at home in the church or should be most at home in the church are pretty much only those who are all in. And then it's a question of all into what, right? But it's really into all into orthodoxy, the traditional way of being a Latter-day Saint. Now, when we ask the question, okay, now tell us what you personally believe about this question. Um, the first answer, everyone should feel at home in the culture of the church, 66%. Okay. Those who are all in, only 8%. So think of the contrast. In the culture, 83%. In my personal belief, only 8%. And then anyone sincerely seeking God, 15% in the culture, 26% in people's personal beliefs. And so whenever you have an imbalance, this great. In the culture, it's 83% say those who are all in, but in their personal beliefs, only 8%. That giant disparity is tension creating, right? So if you're somebody that doesn't think that the culture should be for those that are all in, and by the way, in our survey, 92% of people said, yeah, we don't think that's who should be most at home, then you're feeling two things. One is you're feeling a sense of isolation because you feel like, wow, the way that I believe is clearly not the cultural norm. And then you feel a bit marginalized, right? Because you feel like, well, I'm an outlier. And so that's a good example of the tensions that cause people to feel uncomfortable and may eventually lead them away from the church. Um,
I also I also think, if I may just jump in a little bit,
yeah, please.
I think it's interesting that what you're locking in on in your research is the experience or the perception of the people that are being surveyed, meaning this is not official, correlated, taught in any kind of manual, but
No,
it's the interior and relational experience of people on the ground, and that
yes,
matters in
it does. It
situations
does.
like
It
this.
does matter. It's a great point, Valerie. Now, I'm going to just dive in one level deeper on the data and give you some examples. We then followed up with a question: how comfortable are different people in the culture, right? And we gave people a 5 point scale. So if they answered five, it was extremely comfortable. If they answered four, it's very comfortable. And then, for example, if they answered one or two, it's extremely or very uncomfortable, right? So that's the scale. Um, Going from the most comfortable to the least comfortable, a traditional devout member, 3.9. Parents whose child just married in the temple, 3.9. So very comfortable. A mother who works outside the home, 2.6. Someone who is financially poor, 2.5. Someone who loves the gospel and church but doesn't believe in the restoration, 2.5. Someone who follows their conscience more than church leaders, 2.3. Someone who's older than 30 and single, 2.3. Excuse me, 2.1. 2.2. Somebody who's divorced, 2.2. Somebody who didn't serve a full-time mission, 2.2. Somebody who is LGBTQ plus, 2.1.
Mm.
Okay, so you can see how people believe, well, depending on who you are, you're going to be either very or very much not comfortable in the culture. Make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. Jeff, would you, as we close this imbalance number one, I want to, after we talk about each imbalance, I would love for you to share with us your hopes and dreams. What are your aspirations of how we could become a more balanced culture in this particular way when it comes to too narrowly defining who is acceptable in the LDS Church?
Yeah, and Valerie, it's such a good question. I want to speak directly to an issue here, and then I'll tell you what I think the solution is. So some might say, and I would understand this perspective. Hey, there really shouldn't be any conditions or standards at all. Just we should accept everyone in every way. And I see the merit of that, but I think that's an incomplete perspective. And so I actually believe in standards. I'm using the term standards to represent, doctrine, commandments, expectations, policies, whatever it might be. I believe in standards, but I think what the mistake we make is when we use standards to sort and sift people instead of love and lift people. I think what the gospel really teaches is that standards are there to elevate us, to help us grow, to inspire us, to help us be better, not to organize us into tiers or into some kind of caste system in sorting and sifting. And so I think the answer, what I hope for is I don't believe we should throw out standards. I do believe that we should see standards for what they're really intended for, which is to love people, lift people, inspire people, help people grow. And I think if we can adopt that mindset more consistently across the church, we'll be in the right place.
Yeah. I think about some of the older faith traditions that have their histories and their standards and also make space for interpretation, for dialogue, for the examination of standards as time and culture brings about new restorations and evolution. And I think if this is sort of an ongoing dialogue, it is more about the culture creating standards that are a reflection of greater degrees of light and truth, as
Yes,
opposed to the
yes.
throwing out of or the having no dialogue at all and them staying still forever.
Yeah. That's such a good point. And I'll just share a little anecdote. So my lead editor, a wonderful woman named Lisa, she's very, very orthodox and traditional. She worked as an editor for Deseret Book for many, many years. And so she and I had this wonderful give and take as we were working on the book together. And I'll give you one example. She at this point in the book, she said, Jeff, it's not just that we need to make sure we see standards as a mechanism of loving and lifting instead of sorting. We need to make sure that we're not emphasizing the wrong standards, man-made standards, cultural standards that have no bearing whatsoever in the gospel, and actually placing those standards above the standards that God has given us. And I felt such a sense of, excitement about Lisa's comment because I thought, yeah, that's absolutely right. I don't know if you're familiar with, I think his name's Craig Hilton, Brother Hilton, that's a teacher, a professor at BYU. He coined the term putting fences inside fences, right? So sometimes the church and the gospel create fences or boundaries that are supposed to be helpful and protective. But then what we do is we actually put fences inside the fences, right? Man-made fences that really alter the standard entirely. I think that's part of what is problematic here that creates the unhealthy tension.
Thank you for that. Let's move to imbalance number two. So, we're talking about how we as a community can create healthier culture by looking at these four imbalances that your research found. So, go ahead and share with
Yeah,
us what
let's
that is.
this is about transcendence, but the imbalance is shallow soil full of stones, right? And by stones, what I mean is traditions instead of truth. And so the imbalance is stopping at sanctuary on our way to transcendence. And sometimes our cultural stones are really designed to cause us to see the church and the church community as a sanctuary. And the tension is realizing you can't grow in a sanctuary, right? And Valerie, I think you and I agree. I think God created his children to grow.
Yes.
And life is scary sometimes. And we do need sanctuary sometimes. We need to withdraw at times, take a breath, exhale, um, revitalize ourselves. But at the end of the day, we have to get back in the arena and go forward and take on the challenges of life. And so this imbalance is where, I had a missionary who struggles with this issue. That went to the Utah Young Single Adult Conference 2 years ago. And so she happened to reach out to Sarah and I, and here was her comment. She said to me, she said, Jeff, when did the church become a bomb shelter? Right? And she said, I felt like I went to this young single adult conference, and the entire message was The world is a terrible, scary place. Flee into the arms of the church where you'll find refuge. And she said, I appreciate that message and I see the value of that as a rest stop. But ultimately, isn't the gospel a gospel of transformation, of facing the challenges of life, encountering the challenges of life, learning, growing, getting better, and overcoming as opposed to retreating? And so that's really the essence of this imbalance. To what degree are we using the gospel and the church to prepare people for the realities of life as opposed to, retreating away from those realities and taking sanctuary in the church? Make sense?
It makes sense. And what I think about when I'm listening to you is how sometimes what evokes a faith crisis is this tendency to engage in some form of transactional magical thinking
Yes.
where we are told if you do this or believe this, then you will be protected or insulated from fill in the blank. And that only works until it doesn't.
Yeah.
and and then people start to question their own faith, their own goodness, or they start to question the premise, which is,
Yes.
did my church set me up to feel as if either I am not good enough to be deserving of what one deserves if they participate correctly in the transaction, or maybe this whole entire transactional relationship is incorrect, and I have been led in a direction that is causing me amplified pain and suffering, because life itself actually is all about discomfort and growth, and I mean
Yeah, absolutely.
joy and good things too. But if we if we set ourselves up to believe that life is not about growth and development and struggle and learning, and if we just do the right thing, then we don't have to feel any of these things, then we are actually setting people up to have a double dose of pain and suffering, the pain itself, and then the pain that comes from being given a, a premise through the church sometimes that life is not what it actually is.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So well said. So, there's a section in this chapter of the book where I talk about stones versus roots. And so, would it be okay if I just give a little bit of an overview?
Sure.
There are four areas, and I don't know that we have time to talk all four, but Valerie, I'll just take my cue from you and I'll give a very high level description of the four, and then we can dive in as you feel best. But so on one side you have stones, the stones of our traditions, and on the other side you have the roots of the gospel, right? And so these are all in response to sort of existential, challenging questions that life puts in our laps. The first one is, what in the world do we do with all of the uncertainty that we face? Valerie, we don't even know what's going to happen tomorrow, right? And so uncertainty is part of life. The stone is certitude. You can and should know with certainty. The root is faith. You can move forward when you don't or can't know. And so, if we teach certitude instead of faith, we actually set people up for failure. We make the gospel a caricature of itself. The second one is opposition, right? Of course, opposition is an inherent part of life. And so the stone would be refuge. Seek rescue and reward through your obedience and worthiness. The root would be transformation. Learn and grow through struggle, right? Now, I don't know about you, but I haven't found a lot of refuge and rescue in my obedience and worthiness. What I've found is a whole lot of learning and growth through my struggle.
Yes.
And my faith and my beliefs have drawn me through that. But a very real and damaging example is we had missionaries who were given the stone of refuge. And it might have been by a parent or a church leader saying, look, if you'll serve a mission and you'll be worthy and you'll serve with all your heart, might, mind, and strength, the Lord will bless and protect and watch over your family while you're gone. Guess what? That is not true. And so there are many worthy, obedient, faithful missionaries that still suffer terrible tragedy at home, like the death of a sibling or the death of a parent. And so when they've been taught a gospel based on the stones of tradition, and then the complexities and challenges of life sort of blow that up, it can lead to a faith crisis because they can say, wait a minute, I was taught that this was the gospel, but really it was a caricature of the gospel. And it failed me in the biggest moment of my life when my sibling was taken, right? The third one is character, right? So how do we become the type of people we want to become? So the stone is, well, you do that through avoidance. You remain unblemished and sinless, right? So avoid anything that could, scar you. The root of the gospel is development. It's become complete, mistakes and all, right? So it's interesting in Matthew 5:48, be ye therefore perfect. The word perfect, if you go back to the original Greek word, it doesn't mean unblemished. It means whole or complete, right? Which makes allowances, not only makes allowances for being human, but celebrates being human as a necessary part of our development and growth. And then the fourth one is, well, where do we find meaning in our lives, right? How do we, all human beings need meaning. And so the stone is, well, find it in yourself, in self perfecting, in religious devotion, right? So the more you perfect yourself, the more you're devoted to your religion, the more you'll find meaning. The root of the gospel is no, you lose yourself. You find meaning in serving others, even in your weakness, right? And so I think to the degree that we teach the stones instead of the roots, we're really providing a caricature of the gospel that doesn't really stand up to the tests of the complexity and challenges of life. And that very directly contributes to faith crisis in people.
Which to me means I think about faith crisis as someone being on schedule and prepared for, or having been prepared for, what is the catapult or the catalyst into a deepening uh, confrontation with the divine.
Yes,
And
for sure. So well said.
yeah, and so I think what I'm hearing you say is that we are learning from those who have been in this space on this journey, and we're trying to help their devout loved ones better understand that one of the reasons why we are struggling as we are is because I can speak for my audience, the super hyperactive Latter-day Saint population, that they were so deeply committed to the transactional, the if then,
Yes,
or this the sanctuary idea. But inevitably, if you live long enough, the match ceases to match the terrain.
yes,
And so what I'm hearing you say is that perhaps what we can do in our homes and in our families when this happens to one of our loved ones is that we can create a holding environment to help them wrestle with the reality that, to some degree, and forgive me if this is a little bit, I don't know, this might feel strong, but I think to some degree, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is interested in, or kind of teaches some degree of fundamentalism, which is a love of certainty, a love of, or a wish for a wish to provide a map that will always match one's territory. And
yes,
that
yes.
just isn't that
Not
that
possible.
it's not possible, and therefore it is by default going to fail us. And so perhaps what we do if we want to stay connected to our tradition is, with a lot of compassion and grace, recognize that the church sells something that it can't stand by. It's not
Oh,
going to work. And so we as humans, uh, community members, family members, can continue to grow beyond what the church sometimes is talking about, because it doesn't hold up under the pressure of real life. And so, sort of an acknowledgement, a grace, a recognition that church systems and humans grow at different paces. And to some degree, I think our Mormon population is growing slightly faster than their church. And that's
yeah,
sometimes how evolution and even restoration of truth happens at the doctrinal level. It happens because enough people have enough experiences and hits a critical mass, and then sometimes a church system awakens to greater light and truth. And we as a church system talk all the time about restoration. Restoration happens when enough human beings diligently experiencing spiritual growth offer feedback that what is being taught isn't resonating or serving the realities of their own spiritual journeys. But it sometimes happens where we're feeling these things and it feels like the church doesn't have the resources or the language or the understanding to know how to help us. And so what you're talking about, I think, is until they can catch up, maybe we can help one another in our homes, in our
Yeah.
local settings.
Yeah, and Valerie, it's funny. As we're talking about, sort of the difference between real life and the map. There was a wonderful quote that I loved that I ended up not putting in the book, but it speaks to this moment so well. It's every mariner knows that the map is not the sea.
Amen.
Right? And so I think it's so healthy to acknowledge that. Now part of what I think the church tries to do, and people like Richard Rohr, who generally is an admirer of our church, he uses, as you know, the idea of the first half of life, second half of life, building the container and then figuring out what you do with the container. We're really good at building that container,
Yes,
right?
we are.
And that's the map, right? And so for me, my Latter-day Saint map in general has been enormously helpful, like hugely helpful to me in my life, right up until the very moment when it wasn't.
Yep.
And what happened is life happened, reality happened, and then all of a sudden I was on my own. I didn't have the map to rely on. And I think what we could do better is tell people, hey, this map is incredibly useful. It's an approximation of the territory, but there will be times and places in your life where it won't provide what you need, and that's normal and it's healthy, and that's where you get to grow, you get to rely more directly on God for guidance, and we celebrate that. And that's just an indication that you're dealing with complexity that's hard to put in the boilerplate map.
Yeah.
And so, you have our blessing and our best wishes as you navigate that, right? What
And
a
what you're
wonderful thing that would be.
Well, and what you're actually like hearkening back to from earlier in our conversation today is a little less on the side of protectiveness and a little or a lot more on the side of welcoming
Yeah.
growth, more flexibility. Because if they did that, certainly, at the general level, but even if we begin by doing this amongst ourselves and one another, is we actually invite our loved ones and feel invited if we are that person whose map is no longer matching the territory.
Yes,
We start to feel like, okay, I can continue to negotiate this
absolutely.
in a way that doesn't mean I have to either choose my integrity or my community.
Yeah, that's right. And
Yeah,
you also mentioned something really powerful I want to come back to, which is these moments when your map suddenly doesn't have the answers you need. They're tremendous opportunities for growth. Now, it's scary. Like, for me, the biggest breakdown in my trusted Latter-day Saint map happened when my son left the church. And guess what? That was not on my map, you
right.
know. And so for several years it was a very difficult thing. It was a time of hopelessness and despair, and I just didn't yet understand that I was being invited to grow. Now it's been 13 years. I look back on it and I go, wow, it actually wasn't a crisis or a disaster. It's ended up being this wonderful transformative experience for me and my whole family that we went through together, and it's a good thing.
Yes. And I think what generally helps people feel the stability to move forward and really lean into their growth is coming to an awakening sometimes. It feels very, very radical to our own uh, minds as when we're in an earlier stage of belief or we're more sort of devout and this starts to happen is this very thing that is unfolding that is the catalyst to deeper richer spiritual growth moving forward that has not been we have no idea that this is what is happening as a good
Yeah.
thing. In other words, we have to
Yes. Yeah.
redefine what is happening because what we know from psychological and from even faith development psychological perspectives is this is exactly what the arc of growth looks like. It's to sort of be a
Absolutely.
receiver of identity and belief, to outsource uh, our authority and even decisions, and then a turning point happens, a transition happens where we start questioning those very constructs in an effort to choose for ourselves who we are and what we believe on our own terms. Some of those things stay put exactly as they were received in the first place. Some things radically change, but that is on schedule if that is happening. But
Yes.
the trauma comes when we don't know that that is on schedule and that what we're doing is deeply spiritual work.
Yeah, and even worse if we pathologize it, right? And
Precisely.
so what I've experienced and what I see in the research is when the map breaks down, it creates massive tension in the individual, right? It's the tension that's the catalyst for growth because nobody likes to live in tension, right? So what we do is we say, man, I'm feeling tremendous conflict. What needs to change? What do I need to learn? How do I need to rethink this? Is there something I need to do differently? And it's those questions that ultimately lead you to grow. And so it's just a good, normal, natural, healthy thing. And we need to normalize it and embrace it more.
Yes. Okay, so we're a little short on time, so I'm going to ask a favor of you. Can you summarize imbalances number 3 and number 4? I'm actually looking at them on my notes, and they do look like they are somewhat related. Are
Yeah,
you
I'd be happy to. And so I'll do it kind of concisely, and then if you want to talk more, we can. But imbalance number 3, sorry, Val, I'm going to just do it. Let me do it from the book so that I can be a little more
sure?
articulate. So imbalance number 3 is soil full of thorns, and those thorns represent when our agency is compromised. And so the imbalance is being expected to always defer to church traditions and leaders. The tension is the collision between authority and conscience. And so the question is, how do we honor God's gift of agency in a culture that expects compliance, right?
Wow.
Now, agency is one of the church's doctrines. Obedience is one of the church's doctrines. So they're both part of our theology. They're both good, but they're supposed to be in balance, right? And as you know, I use a new word for some people in the book, fealty. Fealty is obedience minus agency, right? And that's an imbalance. We're picking one of the two doctrines to emphasize at the expense of the other, and I don't think that's what God intends. And we could go into more detail there, but that's the essence of it. And the key thing is agency is absolutely necessary to grow. If all you're doing is conforming and complying, you're not thinking, you're not deciding, you're not dealing with the consequences of your choice, you're not developing confidence in your ability to choose and navigate complex issues. And I believe our heavenly parents want us to grow, and agency is a key catalyst for that growth. So that's imbalance number 3. Should we do number 4?
Let me comment a little bit on number 3, just because it's such an important one, and I feel like it is at the core of the struggle that people have in their desire to continue on this sort of self-defining faith expansion experience, and how sometimes they feel like they just the tension is so much at church and or in conversation with loved ones because what they're doing is scary and new, but it is the awakening of their higher self. It's that sense
Yeah.
that there's something deep within me that is uh, becoming stronger and stronger and more confident in my discerning what is goodness, light, and truth. And the question of obedience is interesting because oftentimes we begin with obedience to authority externally, and where when it evolves is to obedience to one's conscience.
Yes.
And one's conscience can also discern if an outside authority is trustworthy or
Yes.
not, right?
Yes.
And so
Yes.
it's not about throwing out external feedback, or it's not even about being sort of like anti authority. It's more about discernment of authority, and that I dare say your audience saw this as a deep imbalance because what they felt sometimes is as if their own awakening Christ consciousness was being denied or stifled. And what would a community look like if you were able to sort of look at this and balance it? Tell me, or tell us if you would, Jeff, how could we do better as a community, allowing people to sort of like enrich this beautiful thing that's unfolding as
Yeah.
opposed to stifling it and causing them to go elsewhere?
You know what, Valerie, the word that comes to mind for me when I listen to you ask that question is trust people more.
Yeah.
And so let me give you an example. So in my personal life, and I think this is typical, there, for every 100 decisions that I've had to make in life, I would say 90% of them I'm very aligned with the church and with my church leaders. It's like, well, they say that you should do this, and I agree that I should do that. And so really we're talking about exceptional things. But for example, I as a mission president, there were times when I would counsel with missionaries about these kinds of issues. And there was a perception that among many missionaries that they just needed to do exactly what the mission president said or exactly what the mission president thought. And there were times when I would counsel with missionaries where we disagreed on what the right choice was, but I trusted them. And I'd say, you know what? I think you and I probably disagree on this issue, but this is your life and you get to make that decision. And I trust you to make it. And so I'm not gonna counsel you. I'm not gonna tell you what you should do. So you go forward and you do what you feel is right, what you think God wants you to do. But I would appreciate it if you'd let me know how it goes, right? And so trusting an individual when there's an exceptional thing and there's a dilemma and there's maybe a conflict between the authority of the church and the church leader and the conscience of the individual, be a little more inclined to trust the conscience of the individual and give them the latitude they need to claim their agency and exercise their agency.
That's
As you know, I tell a beautiful story. I read a letter that I was written to me by one of my sister missionaries. And I won't take the time to repeat it all here, but the bottom line was she felt she was supposed to go home from her mission early. Now, that's clearly not towing the company line, so to speak. And so she did. She went home early, and then she sent me this beautiful letter 6 months later, telling me what she had learned from the experience. And it's an extraordinary story and a beautiful illustration of the principle we're talking about here.
what you're picking, or what I'm picking up on, Jeff, is a couple things. And I know I mentioned we need to move on, and here I am pausing us, but I will just say this and then we can move on, is that I am often struck by the goodness of who we are as human beings who are also divine, and that we are here to awaken to our divine. And the way that that happens is by our trusting ourselves and one another to practice that very kind of discernment. And so if we feel that we are not allowed to do that, or if we feel that there is an encouragement or even a reinforcement of not practicing that, or the price is too high or the punishment too great, from how we experience God or punishment or sin or whatever, then actually we're curtailing the very essence of why we're here. And so,
Without a
yeah.
doubt, Valerie, if I could end this little portion with a beautiful quote from Latter-day Saint historian, scholar, and writer Melissa Inouye, and she passed away a few years ago, but she said this, and I think it captures it so well. She said, "If our heavenly parents had intended for everyone to think alike and to follow the same path back to them, they would have endorsed Lucifer's plan. Instead, they gave us the power of agency, which is the power to make terrible mistakes and cause lasting damage. But it is also the power to be brave, to be wise, to extend the self, and to be a true healer."
love love Melissa's work in general, and I couldn't agree with that more. That in some ways I think we completely miss the point when we are trying so hard to comply that we don't actually use the very agency we were given to learn and to grow. And that's why I have a very different definition of even sin, because my sense is that all of the things that we do is a in the service of learning who we are. And the thing too that I think is fascinating, that isn't often I think appreciated, is that as a divine being, each and every one of us will be drawn toward goodness as we have experiences that are sort of that align with our divinity, and we will not feel good when we do things that are not aligned. And so we're going to learn these things.
Yeah,
We don't
yes,
really
we
need a whole
are.
bunch of rules and punishments because they will flow from us naturally as
You,
we experience things.
you
Go
know
ahead.
what's interesting to me is this one agency might be the place where our theology and our culture are most intensely in conflict. And so here's an example. So in the temple endowment, when Adam and Eve are kicked out of the Garden of Eden, you remember that Eve turns to Adam and says, "It's better that we pass through sorrow that we might learn from our experience good from evil." That's what we're talking about here. So that's our theology, but our culture is agency wink wink,
Yeah.
you know. And so I think this is one where the answer is just embrace our theology, which is agency, and recognize agency and obedience have to be balanced.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Let's pivot over to your final
Yeah,
imbalance
yeah.
number 4.
Imbalance number 4, soil that grows only one kind of plant. So the imbalance is pressure to conform. And the tension is pretending to be something you're not in order to fit in. And all I do is just say, when I'm talking to somebody about this, I just say, have you ever been in a position, maybe it's in a church setting, on a soccer team, in your school choir, it doesn't matter what group you were part of, where you had to pretend to be something you are not in order to be accepted? It's a terrible feeling, right? Because who we are inside is hardwired into our identity and our personality. And if you have to suppress that and alter it in order to present yourself in a more publicly acceptable way, it's very, very difficult to do. And the word we have for that is pretense, right? And it creates enormous conflict inside a person's soul to have to live in an environment of pretense. And so guess what? If that persists very long, they will step away from that environment at some point.
It sort of encapsulates the larger conversation that we've been having, I think, that each of these tensions to me is kind of circling us back to the same question. Are we a community that is about supporting one another in their wrestle towards awakening to who we truly are as children of God or as divine beings? And if we are that thing or aspire to be that thing, then what follows is that we become a community that is open to the real, authentic, genuine experience
Yes.
of one another, not what we wish it were or what we think it should be, but what it actually is.
Yeah, and I think the challenge that our church has, and that really all institutional churches have, is that in an effort to inculcate good things into their members, they become formulaic, right? There becomes a map or a checklist or a formula that you're supposed to follow. And there's value in that. I believe in that, right? But I see them as frameworks, not prescriptive checklists. And at the end of the day, each one of us are individuals and we have to figure life out for ourselves. Hopefully we'll be led and guided by true and good principles, some of which will come from our the religious institutions we belong to. But at the end of the day, it's your life and you're accountable for it. And so you have to decide how you're going to make those decisions and how you're going to live your life. And we need to celebrate people that are trying to do that with good intentions, right? Because it's a growth process for sure.
I love that. I want to just summarize what we have talked about thus far as we get ready to wrap this episode and this series up, Jeff. Today, we talked about what we are learning from lots and lots of people who are historically very, very devout members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and have found themselves either on the edge or having moved beyond the edge of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints because of some of the following reasons. Not feeling as if who they were becoming in their authentic wrestle was acceptable. They also felt that when life's realities confronted them, what they had learned at church was not helpful or did not bolster them up in terms of giving them the resources or the support that they needed. Also, they have taught us that sometimes their very growth process is curtailed by the need to be obedient to something that may not feel as if it is resonant with their own conscience. And then finally, a pressure to conform or a pressure to show up in a way that is acceptable to something on the outside of us or someone instead of showing up as we are, who we are. And so, what we, I think, can learn here is that human beings, as we're spiritual beings, we are here to have complex lives. They're going to be different. They're going to have twists and turns in them. And what we want to provide is not only a structure, but also a community that is wide awake to the realities and the complexities of this life, and that we can hold space for what people are experiencing as not like something's gone wrong, but that if life is unfolding, something is happening that is growth oriented. And even in the messiness of it all, that we can stand with and by each other. And if we're able to do that, then we create something that you mentioned at the very beginning of your book. It's an African philosophy,
Mhm.
and the word is, I hope I say this right, Ubuntu.
Ubuntu.
Ubuntu. And this is, I'll say a little bit, then I'm going to have you speak into it and close us up today. It's an African philosophy that translates into an idea about all of us being human. I am because we are, or we are, a person is a person through other people. It emphasizes community, compassion, and the belief that our individual identities are deeply interconnected to those in our close proximity, but also to those in the world around us. It teaches us that we cannot be human in isolation. Our own growth and well being and humanity is directly tied to one another. And I think that is what I wanted to end with this, because that's aspirational. I think it happens in a good moment, in a good congregation. In some families are able to achieve this with beautiful diversity. And also what your book is lovingly and compassionately communicating, Jeff, is that we could use some more Ubuntu in the Church of
Yes.
Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
Yeah, I think we can. And again, it goes back to a balance thing, right? I would say that Ubuntu is on the nourishment side of the soil. And it's a great concept. And the person who taught me about that was somebody that spends a lot of time in South Africa and is very familiar with the culture of South Africa, and also very familiar with the church. And he suggested that this to me was a pretty good concept for describing maybe aspirationally what we can shoot for. And Valerie, I think so. So certainly, love and compassion are a big part of that, right? Seeing other people as they really are. And then I think humility and faith, humility to recognize the limitations of our map. Now, that doesn't mean that you throw out the map and say the map is worthless. You say, look, the map is what it's for, which is to be a framework and a guide. But ultimately, I have to recognize it's not intended to be complete and perfect. And then having faith in yourself and in the people around you to navigate the areas where the map requires you to do your own navigation and to believe in each other more. And I think that that's part of the spirit of Ubuntu as
Yeah.
well.
I love that. I love this conversation. I'm so grateful, Jeff, that you've given so many of your years and so many, I think you said 22 renderings of this
Yes.
book, in an effort to help families, marriages, wards, relationships come to a place where what we privilege more than anything else is to love one another.
Yes. Yeah, I agree. Hey, you know what? I just feel grateful for the chance that you give me to come and visit with you and to connect with your audience. My greatest hope is that this book will be a tool for individuals and families to maybe deal with their fear a little bit, heal relationships, and find greater depth and meaning in their faith.
I have high hopes for this. So I hope all of you out there listening will pick one of these books up, and then after you've read it, give it as a gift to one of your loved ones or friends. That would be such a beautiful step in the direction of healing the polarization and the divides that we experience in our faith community right now. So Thank you so much, Jeff. And
Very welcome.
we will see you all next week. Take care, y'all. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to Latter-day Struggles. If this podcast has supported your faith journey, we invite you to explore the many ways you can continue your healing and growth with us. On our website, you'll find support and processing groups, marriage and parenting courses, and free resources to support where you are in your faith journey. You can also join Valerie in the live fellowship gatherings throughout the year, where we connect, process the podcast, and build meaningful friendships with others on similar paths. If cost has ever been a barrier, we offer podcast scholarships funded by listener donations. To explore all of these offerings, visit the link in today's show notes or go to latterdaystruggles.com. And if this podcast has been meaningful to you, leaving a 5-star review is one of the most powerful ways to help others find this work. Latter-day Struggles is proud to be part of the Dialogue Podcast Network.
Dialogue Podcast Network.